Chapter 3. Ontological Insecurity. We can now state more precisely the nature of our clinical inquiry. A man may have a sense of his presence in the world as a real, alive, whole, and, in a temporal sense, continuous person. As such, he can live out into the world and meet others, a world and others experienced as equally real, alive, whole, and continuous. Such a basically ontologically, despite the philosophical use of ontology by Heidegger, Sartre, Tillich especially, I've used the term in its present empirical sense because it appears to be the best adverbial or adjectival derivative of being. Such a basically ontologically secure person will encounter all the hazards of life, social, ethical, spiritual, biological, from a centrally firm sense of his own and other people's reality and identity. It is often difficult for a person with such a sense of his integral selfhood and personal identity, of the permanency of things, of the reliability of natural processes, of the substantiality of natural processes, of the substantiality of others, to transpose himself into the world of an individual whose experiences may be utterly lacking in any unquestionable self-validating certainties. This study is concerned with the issues involved where there is the partial or almost complete absence of the assurances derived from an existential position of what I shall call primary ontological security, with anxieties and dangers that I shall suggest arise only in terms of primary ontological insecurity, and with the consequent attempts to deal with such anxieties and dangers. The literary clinic Lionel Trilling, 1955, points up the contrast that I wish to make between a basic existential position of ontological security and one of ontological insecurity, very clearly in comparing the worlds of Shakespeare and Keats on the one hand and of Kafka on the other. Quote, "For Keats, the awareness of evil exists side by side with a very strong sense of personal identity, and is for that reason the less immediately apparent. To some contemporary readers it will seem for the same reason the less intense. In the same way, it may seem to a contemporary reader that if we compare Shakespeare and Kafka, leaving aside the degree of genius each has, and considering both only as expositors of man's suffering and cosmic alienation, it is Kafka who makes the more intense and complete exposition. And indeed, the judgment may be correct, exactly because, for Kafka, the sense of evil is not contradicted by the sense of personal identity. Shakespeare's world, quite as much as Kafka's, is that prison cell which Pascal says the world is, from which daily the inmates are led forth to die. Shakespeare, no less than Kafka, forces upon us the cruel irrationality of the conditions of human life, the tale told by an idiot, the puerile gods who torture us not for punishment but for sport. And no less than Kafka, Shakespeare is revolted by the fetter of the prison of this world. Nothing is more characteristic of him than his imagery of disgust. But in Shakespeare's cell, the company is so much better than in Kafka's. The captains and kings and lovers and clowns of Shakespeare are alive and complete before they die. In Kafka, long before the sentence is executed, even long before the malign legal process is even instituted, something terrible has been done to the accused. We all know what that is. He has been stripped of all that is becoming to a man except his abstract humanity, which, like his skeleton, never is quite becoming to a man. He is without parents, home, wife, child, commitment, or appetite. He has no connection with power, beauty, love, wit, courage, loyalty, or fame, and the pride that may be taken in these. So that we may say that Kafka's knowledge of evil exists without the contradictory knowledge of the self and its health and validity, that Shakespeare's knowledge of evil exists with that contradiction in its fullest possible force." End quote. We find, as Trilling points out, that Shakespeare does depict characters who evidently experience themselves as real and alive and complete, however riddled by doubts or torn by conflicts they may be. With Kafka, this is not so. Indeed, the effort to communicate what being alive is like, in the absence of such assurances, seems to characterize the work of a number of writers and artists of our time. Life without feeling alive. With Samuel Beckett, for instance, one enters a world in which there is no contradictory sense of the self in its health and validity to mitigate the despair, terror, and boredom of existence. In such a way, the two tramps who wait for Godot are condemned to live. Estragon. "We always find something, eh, Didi, to give us the impression that we exist?" Vladimir impatiently. "Yes, yes, we're magicians, but let us persevere in what we have resolved, before we forget." In painting, Francis Bacon, among others, seems to be dealing with similar issues. Generally, it is evident that what we shall discuss here clinically is but a small sample of something in which human nature is deeply implicated, and to which we can contribute only a very partial understanding. To begin at the beginning, biological birth is a definitive act whereby the infant organism is precipitated into the world. There it is, a new baby, a new biological entity, already with its own ways, real and alive, from our point of view. But what of the baby's point of view? Under usual circumstances, the physical birth of a new living organism into the world inaugurates rapidly ongoing processes whereby, within an amazingly short time, the infant feels real and alive and has a sense of being an entity, with continuity in time and a location in space. In short, physical birth and biological aliveness are followed by the baby becoming existentially born as real and alive. Usually, this development is taken for granted and affords the certainty upon which all other certainties depend. This is to say, not only do adults see children to be real biologically viable entities, but they experience themselves as whole persons who are real and alive, and conjunctively experience other human beings as real and alive. These are self-validating data of experience. The individual, then, may experience his own being as real, alive, whole, as differentiated from the rest of the world in ordinary circumstances so clearly that his identity and autonomy are never in question, as a continuum in time, as having an inner consistency, substantiality, genuineness, and worth, as spatially coextensive with the body, and usually as having begun in or around birth, and liable to extinction with death. He thus has a firm core of ontological security. This, however, may not be the case. The individual in the ordinary circumstances of living may feel more unreal than real, in a literal sense more dead than alive, precariously differentiated from the rest of the world, so that his identity and autonomy are always in question. He may lack the experience of his own temporal continuity. He may not possess an overriding sense of personal consistency or cohesiveness. He may feel more insubstantial than substantial, and unable to assume that the stuff he is made of is genuine, good, valuable, and he may feel himself as partially divorced from his body. It is, of course, inevitable that an individual whose experience of himself is of this order can no more live in a secure world than he can be secure in himself. The whole physiognomy of his world will be correspondingly different from that of the individual whose sense of self is securely established in its health and validity. Relatedness to other persons will be seen to have a radically different significance and function. To anticipate, we can say that in the individual whose own being is secure in this primary experiential sense, relatedness with others is potentially gratifying, whereas the ontologically insecure person is preoccupied with preserving rather than gratifying himself. The ordinary circumstances of living threaten his low threshold of security. If a position of primary ontological security has been reached, the ordinary circumstances of life do not afford a perpetual threat to one's own existence. If such a basis for living has not been reached, the ordinary circumstances of everyday life constitute a continual and deadly threat. Only if this is realized is it possible to understand how certain psychoses can develop. If the individual cannot take the realness, aliveness, autonomy, and identity of himself and others for granted, then he has to become absorbed in contriving ways of trying to be real, of keeping himself or others alive, of preserving his identity, in efforts, as he will often put it, to prevent himself losing his self. What are to most people everyday happenings, which are hardly noticed because they have no special significance, may become deeply significant insofar as they either contribute to the sustenance of the individual's being or threaten him with non-being. Such an individual for whom the elements of the world are coming to have, or have come to have, a different hierarchy of significance from that of the ordinary person, is beginning, as we say, to live in a world of his own, or has already come to do so. It is not true to say, however, without careful qualification, that he is losing contact with reality and withdrawing into himself. External events no longer affect him in the same way as they do others. It is not that they affect him less. On the contrary, frequently they affect him more. It is frequently not the case that he is becoming indifferent and withdrawn. It may, however, be that the world of his experience comes to be one he can no longer share with other people. But before these developments are explored, it will be valuable to characterize, under three headings, three forms of anxiety encountered by the ontologically insecure person: engulfment, implosion, and petrification. 1. Engulfment. An argument occurred between two patients in the course of a session in an analytic group. Suddenly, one of the protagonists broke off the argument to say, "I can't go on. You are arguing in order to have the pleasure of triumphing over me. At best, you win an argument. At worst, you lose an argument. I am arguing in order to preserve my existence. The patient was a young man who I would say was sane, but as he stated, his activity in the argument, as in the rest of his life, was not designed to gain gratification, but to, quote, preserve his existence. Now, one might say that if he did, in fact, really imagine that the loss of an argument would jeopardize his existence, then he was, quote, grossly out of touch with reality, and was virtually psychotic. But this is simply to beg the question without making any contribution towards understanding the patient. It is, however, important to know that if you were to subject this patient to a type of psychiatric interrogation recommended in many psychiatric textbooks, within 10 minutes his behavior and speech would be revealing signs of psychosis. It is quite easy to evoke such signs from such a person whose threshold of basic security is so low that practically any relationship with another person, however tenuous or however apparently harmless, threatens to overwhelm him. A firm sense of one's own autonomous identity is required in order that one may be related as one human being to another. Otherwise, any and every relationship threatens the individual with loss of identity. One form this takes can be called engulfment. In this, the individual dreads relatedness as such, with anyone or anything, or indeed even with himself, because his uncertainty about the stability of his autonomy lays him open to the dread lest in any relationship he will lose his autonomy and identity. Engulfment is not simply envisaged as something that is liable to happen willy-nilly, despite the individual's most active efforts to avoid it. The individual experiences himself as a man who is only saving himself from drowning by the most constant, strenuous, desperate activity. Engulfment is felt as a risk in being understood, thus grasped, comprehended, in being loved, or even simply in being seen. To be hated may be feared for other reasons, but to be hated as such is often less disturbing than to be destroyed as it is felt through being engulfed by love. The main maneuver used to preserve identity under pressure from the dread of engulfment is isolation. Thus, instead of the polarities of separateness and relatedness based on individual autonomy, there is the antithesis between complete loss of being by absorption into the other person, engulfment, and complete aloneness, isolation. There is no safe third possibility of a dialectical relationship between two persons, both sure of their own ground and on this very basis able to, quote, lose themselves in each other. Such merging of being can occur in an authentic way only when the individuals are sure of themselves. If a man hates himself, he may wish to lose himself in the other. Then being engulfed by the other is an escape from himself. In the present case, it is an ever-present possibility to be dreaded. It will be shown, however, that what at one moment is most dreaded and strenuously avoided can change to what is most sought. This anxiety accounts for one form of a so-called negative therapeutic reaction to apparently correct interpretation in psychotherapy. To be understood correctly is to be engulfed, to be enclosed, swallowed up, drowned, eaten up, smothered, stifled in, or by, another person's supposed all-embracing comprehension. It is lonely and painful to be always misunderstood, but there is at least from this point of view a measure of safety in isolation. The other's love is therefore feared more than his hatred, or rather all love is sensed as a version of hatred. By being loved, one is placed under an unsolicited obligation. In therapy with such a person, the last thing there is any point in is to pretend to more love or concern than one has. The more the therapist's own necessarily very complex motives for trying to help a person of this kind genuinely converge on a concern for him which is prepared to let him be and is not, in fact, engulfing or merely indifference, the more hope there will be in the horizon. There are many images used to describe related ways in which identity is threatened, which may be mentioned here, as closely related to the dread of engulfment, e.g., being buried, being drowned, being caught and dragged down into quicksand. The image of fire recurs repeatedly. Fire may be the uncertain flickering of the individual's own inner aliveness. It may be a destructive alien power which will devastate him. Some psychotics say in the acute phase that they are on fire, that their bodies are being burned up. A patient describes himself as cold and dry, yet he dreads any warmth or wet. He will be engulfed by the fire or the water, and either way be destroyed. 2. Implosion. This is the strongest word I can find for the extreme form of what Winnicott terms the impingement of reality. Impingement does not convey, however, the full terror of the experience of the world as liable at any moment to crash in and obliterate all identity, as a gas will rush in and obliterate a vacuum. The individual feels that, like the vacuum, he is empty. But this emptiness is him. Although, in other ways, he longs for the emptiness to be filled, he dreads the possibility of this happening, because he has come to feel that all he can be is the awful nothingness of just this very vacuum. Any contact with reality is then in itself experienced as a dreadful threat, because reality, as experienced from this position, is necessarily implosive, and thus, as was relatedness and engulfment, in itself a threat to what identity the individual is able to suppose himself to have. Reality, as such, threatening engulfment or implosion, is the persecutor. In fact, we are all only 2 or 3 degrees Fahrenheit from experiences of this order. Even a slight fever, and the whole world can begin to take on a persecutory, impinging aspect. 3. Petrification and depersonalization. By using the term petrification, one can exploit a number of the meanings embedded in this word. 1. A particular form of terror, whereby one is petrified, i.e. turned to stone. 2. The dread of this happening, the dread, that is, of the possibility of turning or being turned from a live person into a dead thing, into a stone, into a robot, an automaton, without personal autonomy of action, an it without subjectivity. 3. The magical act whereby one may attempt to turn someone else into stone by petrifying him, and, by extension, the act whereby one negates the other person's autonomy, ignores his feelings, regards him as a thing, kills the life in him. In this sense, one may perhaps better say that one depersonalizes him or reifies him. One treats him not as a person, as a free agent, but as an it. Depersonalization is a technique that is universally used as a means of dealing with the other when he becomes too tiresome or disturbing. One no longer allows himself to be responsive to his feelings, and may be prepared to regard him and treat him as though he had no feelings. The people in focus here both tend to feel themselves as more or less depersonalized, and tend to depersonalize others. They are constantly afraid of being depersonalized by others. The act of turning him into a thing is, for him, actually petrifying. In the face of being treated as an it, his own subjectivity drains away from him like blood from the face. Basically, he requires constant confirmation from others of his own existence as a person. A partial depersonalization of others is extensively practiced in everyday life and is regarded as normal, if not highly desirable. Most relationships are based on some partial depersonalizing tendency, insofar as one treats the other not in terms of any awareness of who or what he might be in himself, but as virtually an android robot, playing a role or part in a large machine in which one too may be acting yet another part. It is usual to cherish, if not the reality, at least the illusion, that there is a limited sphere of living free from this dehumanization. Yet it may be in just this sphere that the greater risk is felt, and the ontologically insecure person experiences this risk in highly potentiated form. The risk consists in this. If one experiences the other as a free agent, one is open to the possibility of experiencing oneself as an object of his experience, and thereby of feeling one's own subjectivity drained away. One is threatened with the possibility of becoming no more than a thing in the world of the other, without any life for oneself, without any being for oneself. In terms of such anxiety, the very act of experiencing the other as a person is felt as virtually suicidal. Sartre discusses this experience brilliantly in Part 3 of Being and Nothingness. The issue is in principle straightforward. One may find oneself enlivened and the sense of one's own being enhanced by the other, or one may experience the other as deadening and impoverishing. A person may come to anticipate that any possible relationship with another will have the latter consequences. Any other is then a threat to his self, his capacity to act autonomously, not by reason of anything he or she may do, or not do specifically, but by reason of his or her very existence. Some of the above points are illustrated in the life of James, a chemist, aged 28. The complaint he made all along was that he could not become a person, he had no self. I am only a response to other people, I have no identity of my own. We shall have occasion to describe in detail later the sense of not being one's true self, of living a false self, in chapters 5 and 6. He felt he was becoming more and more a mythical person. He felt he had no weight, no substance of his own. I am only a cork floating on the ocean. This man was very concerned about not having become a person. He reproached his mother for this failure. I was merely her emblem. She never recognized my identity. In contrast to his own belittlement of and uncertainty about himself, he was always on the brink of being overawed and crushed by the formidable reality that other people contained. In contrast to his own lightweight, uncertainty, and insubstantiality, they were solid, decisive, emphatic, and substantial. He felt that in every way that mattered, others were more large-scale than he was. At the same time, in practice, he was not easily overawed. He used two chief maneuvers to preserve security. One was an outward compliance with the other. The second was an inner intellectual Medusa's head he churned on the other. Both maneuvers, taken together, safeguarded his own subjectivity, which he had never to betray openly, and which thus could never find direct and immediate expression for itself. Being secret, it was safe. Both techniques together were designed to avoid the dangers of being engulfed or depersonalized. With his outer behavior, he forestalled the danger to which he was perpetually subject, namely that of becoming someone else's thing, by pretending to be no more than a cork. After all, what safer thing to be in an ocean? At the same time, however, he turned the other person into a thing in his own eyes, thus magically nullifying any danger to himself by secretly totally disarming the enemy. By destroying, in his own eyes, the other person as a person, he robbed the other of his power to crush him. By depleting him of his personal aliveness, that is, by seeing him as a piece of machinery rather than as a human being, he undercut the risk to himself of this aliveness either swamping him, imploding into his own emptiness, or turning him into a mere appendage. This man was married to a very lively and vivacious woman, highly spirited, with a forceful personality and a mind of her own. He maintained a paradoxical relationship with her, in which, in one sense, he was entirely alone and isolated, and in another sense, he was almost a parasite. He dreamt, for instance, that he was a clam stuck to his wife's body. Just because he could dream thus, he had the more need to keep her at bay, by contriving to see her as no more than a machine. He described her laughter, her anger, her sadness with clinical precision, even going so far as to refer to her as it, a practice that was rather chilling in its effect. It then started to laugh. She was an it because everything she did was a predictable, determined response. He would, for instance, tell her, it, an ordinary funny joke, and when she, it, laughed, this indicated her, its entirely conditioned, robot-like nature, which he saw indeed in much the same terms as certain psychiatric theories would use to account for all human actions. I was at first agreeably surprised by his apparent ability to reject and disagree with what I said, as well as to agree with me. This seemed to indicate that he had more of a mind of his own than he perhaps realized, and that he was not too frightened to display some measure of autonomy. However, it became evident that his apparent capacity to act as an autonomous person, with me, was due to his secret maneuver of regarding me not as a live human being, a person in my own right with my own selfhood, but as a sort of robot interpreting device to which he fed input, and which, after a quick commutation, came out with a verbal message to him. With this secret outlook on me as a thing, he could appear to be a person. What he could not sustain was a person-to-person relationship experienced as such. Dreams in which one or other of the above forms of dread is expressed are common in such persons. These dreams are not variations on the fears of being eaten, which occur in ontologically secure persons. To be eaten does not necessarily mean to lose one's identity. Jonah was very much himself, even within the belly of the whale. Few nightmares go so far as to call up anxieties about actual loss of identity, usually because most people, even in their dreams, still meet whatever dangers are to be encountered as persons, who may perhaps be attacked or mutilated, but whose basic existential core is not itself in jeopardy. In the classical nightmare, the dreamer wakes up in terror, but this terror is not the dread of losing the self. Thus, a patient dreams of a fat pig which sits on his chest and threatens to suffocate him. He wakes in terror. At worst, in this nightmare, he is threatened with suffocation, but not with the dissolution of his very being. The defensive method of turning the threatening mother or breast figure into a thing occurs in patients' dreams. One patient dreamt recurrently of a small black triangle, which originated in a corner of his room, and grew larger and larger until it seemed about to engulf him, whereupon he always awoke in great terror. This was a psychotic young man who stayed with my family for several months, and whom I was thus able to get to know rather well. There was only one situation, as far as I could judge, in which he could let himself go without anxiety at not recovering himself again, and that was in listening to jazz. The fact that even in a dream the breast figure has to be so depersonalized is a measure of its potential danger to the self, presumably on the basis of its frightening original personalizations and the failure of a normal process of depersonalization. Medard Boss, 1957, gives examples of several dreams heralding psychosis. In one, the dreamer is engulfed by fire. A woman of hardly 30 years dreamt at a time when she still felt completely healthy that she was afire in the stables. Around her the fire, an ever larger crust of lava, was forming. Half from the outside and half from the inside of her own body, she could see how the fire was slowly becoming choked by this crust. Suddenly she was entirely outside this fire, and, as if possessed, she beat the fire with a club to break the crust and to let some air in. But the dreamer soon got tired, and slowly she, the fire, became extinguished. 4 days after this dream she began to suffer from acute schizophrenia. In the details of the dreamer had exactly predicted the special course of her psychosis. She became rigid at first and, in effect, insisted. 6 weeks afterwards she defended herself once more with all her might against the choking of her life's fire, until finally she became completely extinguished, both spiritually and mentally. Now for some years she has been like a burnt-out crater. In another example, petrification of others occurs, anticipating the dreamer's own petrification. A girl of 23 years dreamt that she had cooked dinner for her family of 5. She had just served it, and she now called her parents and her brothers and sisters to dinner. Nobody replied. Only her voice returned, as if it were an echo from a deep cave. She found the sudden emptiness of the house uncanny. She rushed upstairs to look for her family. In the first bedroom she could see her 2 sisters sitting on 2 beds. In spite of her impatient calls, they remained in an unnaturally rigid position, and did not even answer her. She went up to her sisters and wanted to shake them. Suddenly she noticed that they were stone statues. She escaped in horror and rushed into her mother's room. Her mother, too, had turned into stone, and was sitting inertly in her armchair, staring into the air with glazed eyes. The dreamer escaped into the room of her father. He stood in the middle of it. In her despair she rushed up to him, and, desiring his protection, she threw her arms around his neck. But he, too, was made of stone, and to her utter horror he turned into sand when she embraced him. She awoke in absolute terror, and was so stunned by the dream experience that she could not move for some minutes. This same horrible dream was dreamt by the patient on 4 successive occasions within a few days. At that time, she was apparently the picture of mental and physical health. Her parents used to call her the sunshine of the whole family. 10 days after the 4th repetition of the dream, the patient was taken ill with an acute form of schizophrenia, displaying severe catatonic symptoms. She fell into a state which was remarkably similar to the physical petrification of her family that she had dreamt about. She was now overpowered in waking life by behavior patterns that in her dreams she had merely observed in other persons. It seems to be a general law that at some point those very dangers most dreaded can themselves be encompassed to forestall their actual occurrence. Thus, to forgo one's autonomy becomes the means of secretly safeguarding it. To play possum, to feign death, becomes a means of preserving one's aliveness. See Oberndorf, 1950. To turn oneself into a stone becomes a way of not being turned into a stone by someone else. Be thou hard, exhorts Nietzsche, in a sense that Nietzsche did not, I believe, himself intend. To be stony hard, and thus far dead, forestalls the danger of being turned into a dead thing by another person. Thoroughly to understand oneself, engulf oneself, is a defense against the risk involved in being sucked into the whirlpool of another person's way of comprehending oneself. To consume oneself by one's own love prevents the possibility of being consumed by another. It seems also that the preferred method of attack on the other is based on the same principle as the attack felt to be implicit in the other's relationship to oneself. Thus, the man who is frightened of his own subjectivity being swamped, impinged upon, or congealed by the other is frequently to be found attempting to swamp, to impinge upon, or to kill the other person's subjectivity. The process involves a vicious cycle. The more one attempts to preserve one's autonomy and identity by nullifying the specific human individuality of the other, the more it is felt to be necessary to continue to do so, because with each denial of the other person's ontological status, one's own ontological security is decreased. The threat to the self from the other is potentiated, and hence has to be even more desperately negated. In this lesion in the sense of personal autonomy, there is both a failure to sustain the sense of oneself as a person with the other, and a failure to sustain it alone. There is a failure to sustain a sense of one's own being without the presence of other people. It is a failure to be by oneself, a failure to exist alone. As James put it, other people supply me with my existence. This appears to be in direct contradiction to the aforementioned dread that other people will deprive him of his existence. But contradictory as absurd as it may be, these two attitudes existed in him side by side, and are indeed entirely characteristic of this type of person. The capacity to experience oneself as autonomous means that one has really come to realize that one is a separate person from everyone else. No matter how deeply I am committed in joy or suffering to someone else, he is not me, and I am not him. However lonely or sad one may be, one can exist alone. The fact that the other person in his own actuality is not me is set against the equally real fact that my attachment to him is a part of me. If he dies or goes away, he has gone, but my attachment to him persists. But in the last resort, I cannot die another person's death for him, nor can he die my death. For that matter, as Sartre comments on this thought of Heidegger's, he cannot love for me or make my decisions, and I likewise cannot do this for him. In short, he cannot be me and I cannot be him. If the individual does not feel himself to be autonomous, this means that he can experience neither his separateness from nor his relatedness to the other in the usual way. A lack of sense of autonomy implies that one feels one's being to be bound up in the other, or that the other is bound up in oneself, in a sense that transgresses the actual possibilities within the structure of human relatedness. It means that a feeling that one is in a position of ontological dependency on the other, i.e., dependent on the other for one's very being, is substituted for a sense of relatedness and attachment to him based on genuine mutuality. Utter detachment and isolation are regarded as the only alternative to a clam or vampire-like attachment in which the other person's lifeblood is necessary for one's own survival and yet is a threat to one's survival. Therefore, the polarity is between complete isolation or complete merging of identity, rather than between separateness and relatedness. The individual oscillates perpetually between the two extremes, each equally unfeasible. He comes to live rather like those mechanical toys which have a positive tropism that impels them towards a stimulus until they reach a specific point, whereupon a built-in negative tropism directs them away until the positive tropism takes over again, this oscillation being repeated ad infinitum. Other people were necessary for his existence, said James. Another patient, in the same basic dilemma, behaved in the following way. He maintained himself in isolated detachment from the world for months, living alone in a single room, existing frugally on a few savings, daydreaming. But in doing this, he began to feel he was dying inside. He was becoming more and more empty, and observed a progressive impoverishment of my life mode. A great deal of his pride and self-esteem was implicated in thus existing on his own. But as his state of depersonalization progressed, he would emerge into social life for a brief foray in order to get a dose of other people, but not an overdose. He was like an alcoholic who goes on sudden drinking orgies between dry spells, except that in this case his addiction, of which he was as frightened and ashamed of as any repentant alcoholic or drug addict, was to other people. Within a short while he would come to feel that he was in danger of being caught up or trapped in the circle he had entered, and he would withdraw again into his own isolation in a confusion of frightened hopelessness, suspicion, and shame. Some of the points discussed above are illustrated in the following two cases. Case 1. Anxiety at feeling alone. Mrs. R's presenting difficulty was a dread of being in the street, agoraphobia. On closer inspection, it became clear that her anxiety arose when she began to feel on her own in the street or elsewhere. She could be on her own as long as she did not feel that she was really alone. Briefly, her story was as follows. She was an only and a lonely child. There was no open neglect or hostility in her family. She felt, however, that her parents were always too engrossed in each other for either of them ever to take notice of her. She grew up wanting to fill this hole in her life, but never succeeded in becoming self-sufficient or absorbed in her own world. Her longing was always to be important or significant to someone else. There always had to be someone else. Preferably she wanted to be loved and admired, but if not, then to be hated was much to be preferred to being unnoticed. She wanted to be significant to someone else in whatever capacity, in contrast to her abiding memory of herself as a child, that she did not really matter to her parents, that they neither loved nor hated, admired nor were ashamed of her very much. In consequence, she tried looking at herself in her mirror, but never managed to convince herself that she was somebody. She never got over being frightened if there was no one there. She grew into a very attractive girl and was married at 17 to the first man who really noticed this. Characteristically, it seemed to her, her parents had not noticed that any turmoil had been going on in their daughter until she announced that she was engaged. She was triumphant and self-confident under the warmth of her husband's attentions. But he was an army officer and was shortly posted abroad. She was not able to go with him. At this separation, she experienced severe panic. We should note that her reaction to her husband's absence was not depression or sadness in which she pined or yearned for him. It was panic, as I would suggest, because of the dissolution of something in her, which owed its existence to the presence of her husband and his continued attentions. She was a flower that withered in the absence of one day's rain. However, help came to her through a sudden illness of her mother. She received an urgent plea for help from her father, asking her to come to nurse her mother. For the next year, during her mother's illness, she had never been, as she had put it, so much herself. She was the pivot of the household. There was not a trace of panic until after her mother's death, when the prospect of leaving the place where she had at last come to mean so much, to join her husband, was very much in her mind. Her experience of the last year had made her feel for the first time that she was now her parents' child. Against this, being her husband's wife was now somehow superfluous. Again, one notes the absence of grief at her mother's death. At this time, she began to reckon up the chances of her being alone in the world. Her mother had died, then there would be her father, possibly her husband. Quote, beyond that, nothing. This did not depress her, it frightened her. She then joined her husband abroad and led a gay life for a few years. She craved for all the attention he could give her, but this became less and less. She was restless and unsatisfied. Their marriage broke up and she returned to live in a flat in London with her father. While continuing to stay with her father, she became the mistress and model of a sculptor. In this way she had lived for several years before I saw her when she was 28. This is the way she talked of the street. Quote, in the street, people come and go about their business. You seldom meet anyone who recognizes you. Even if they do, it is just a nod and they pass on, or at most you have a few minutes' chat. Nobody knows who you are. Everyone's engrossed in themselves. No one cares about you. She gave examples of people fainting and everyone's casualness about it. No one gives a damn. It was in this setting and with these considerations in mind that she felt anxiety. This anxiety was at being in the street alone, or rather at feeling on her own. If she went out with or met someone who really knew her, she felt no anxiety. In her father's flat she was often alone, but there it was different. There she never felt really on her own. She made his breakfast. Tidying up the beds, washing up, was protracted as long as possible. The middle of the day was a drag, but she didn't mind too much. Quote, everything was familiar. There was her father's chair and his pipe rack. There was a picture of her mother on the wall looking down on her. It was as though all these familiar objects somehow illumined the house with the presence of the people who possessed them and used them, or had done so, as a part of their lives. Thus, although she was by herself at home, she was always able to have someone with her in a magical way. But this magic was dispelled in the noise and anonymity of the busy street. An insensitive application of what is often supposed to be the classical psychoanalytic theory of hysteria to this patient might attempt to show this woman as unconsciously libidinally bound to her father, with, consequently, unconscious guilt and unconscious need and or fear of punishment. Her failure to develop lasting libidinal relationships away from her father would seem to support the first view, along with her decision to live with him to take her mother's place, as it were, and the fact that she spent most of her day, as a woman of 28, actually thinking about him. Her devotion to her mother in her last illness would be partly the consequences of unconscious guilt at her unconscious ambivalence to her mother, and her anxiety at her mother's death would be anxiety at her unconscious wish for her mother's death coming true, and so on. For extremely valuable psychoanalytic contributions to apparently hysterical symptom formation, see Sagel, 1954. However, the central or pivotal issue in this patient's life is not to be discovered in her unconscious. It is lying quite open for her to see, as well as for us, although this is not to say that there are not many things about herself that this patient does not realize. The pivotal point, upon which all her life is centered, is her lack of ontological autonomy. If she is not in the actual presence of another person who knows her, or if she cannot succeed in evoking this person's presence in his absence, her sense of her own identity drains away from her. Her panic is at the fading away of her being. She is like Tinker Bell. In order to exist, she needs someone else to believe in her existence. How necessary that her lover should be a sculptor, and that she should be his model. How inevitable, given this basic premise of her existence, that when her existence was not recognized, she should be suffused with anxiety. For her, esse is percipi, to be seen, that is, not as an anonymous passerby or casual acquaintance. It was just that form of seeing which petrified her. If she was seen as an anonymity, as no one who especially mattered, or as a thing, then she was no one in particular. She was as she was seen to be. If there was no one else to see her, at the moment, she had to try to conjure up someone, father, mother, husband, lover, at different times in her life, to whom she felt she mattered, for whom she was a person, and to imagine herself in his or her presence. If this person on whom her being depended went away or died, it was not a matter for grief, it was a matter for panic. One cannot transpose her central problem into the unconscious. If one discovered that she has an unconscious fantasy of being a prostitute, this does not explain her anxiety about street walking, or her preoccupation with women who fall in the street and are not helped to get on their feet again. The unconscious fantasy is, on the contrary, to be explained by and understood in terms of the central issue implicating her self-being, her being for herself. Her fear of being alone is not a defense against incestuous libidinal fantasies or masturbation. She had incestuous fantasies. These fantasies were a defense against the dread of being alone, as was her whole fixation on being a daughter. They were a means of overcoming her anxiety at being by herself. The unconscious fantasies of this patient would have an entirely different meaning if her basic existential position were such that she had a starting point in herself that she could leave behind, as it were, in pursuit of gratification. As it was, her sexual life and fantasies were efforts, not primarily to gain gratification, but to seek first ontological security. In lovemaking, an illusion of this security was achieved, and on the basis of this illusion, gratification was possible. It would be a profound mistake to call this woman narcissistic in any proper application of the term. She was unable to fall in love with her own reflection. It would be a mistake to translate her problem into phases of psychosexual development, oral, anal, genital. She grasped at sexuality, as at a straw, as soon as she was of age. She was not frigid. Orgasm could be physically gratifying if she was temporarily secure in the prior ontological sense. In intercourse with someone who loved her, and she was capable of believing in being loved by another, she achieved perhaps her best moments, but they were short-lived. She could not be alone, or let her lover be alone with her. Her need to be taken notice of might facilitate the application of a further cliché to her, that she was an exhibitionist. Once more, such a term is only valid if it is understood existentially. Thus, and this will be discussed in greater detail subsequently, she showed herself off, while never giving herself away. That is, she exhibited herself, while always holding herself inhibited. She was therefore always alone and lonely, although superficially her difficulty was not in being together with other people, her difficulty was least in evidence when she was most together with another person. But it is clear that her realization of the autonomous existence of other people was really quite as tenuous as her belief in her own autonomy. If they were not there, they ceased to exist for her. Orgasm was a means of possessing herself by holding in her arms the man who possessed her. But she could not be herself by herself, and so could not really be herself at all. Case 2. A most curious phenomenon of the personality, one which has been observed for centuries, but which has not yet received its full explanation, is that in which the individual seems to be the vehicle of a personality that is not his own. Someone else's personality seems to possess him, and to be finding expression through his words and actions, whereas the individual's own personality is temporarily lost or gone. This happens with all degrees of malignancy. There seem to be all degrees of the same basic process, from the simple, benign observation that so-and-so takes after his father, or that's her mother's temper coming out in her, to the extreme distress of the person who finds himself under a compulsion to take on the characteristics of a personality he may hate, and or feel to be entirely alien to his own. This phenomenon is one of the most important in occasioning disruption in the sense of one's own identity, when it occurs unwanted and compulsively. The dread of this occurring is one factor in the fear of engulfment and implosion. The individual may be afraid to like anyone, for he finds that he is under a compulsion to become like anyone he likes. As I shall seek to show later, this is one motive for schizophrenic withdrawal. The way in which the individual's self and personality is profoundly modified, even to the point of threatened loss of his or her own identity, and sense of reality by engulfment by such an alien sub-identity, is illustrated in the following case. Miss D, a woman of 40, presented the initial complaint of vague but intense fear. She said she was frightened of everything, even of the sky. She complained of an abiding sense of dissatisfaction, of unaccountable accesses of anger toward her husband, in particular a lack of a sense of responsibility. Her fear was as though somebody was trying to rise up inside and was trying to get out of me. She was very afraid that she was like her mother, whom she hated. What she called unreliability was a feeling of bafflement and bewilderment which she related to the fact that nothing she did had ever seemed to please her parents. If she did one thing and was told it was wrong, she would do another thing and would find that they still said that that was wrong. She was unable to discover, as she put it, what they wanted me to be. She reproached her parents for this above all, that they hadn't given her any way of knowing who or what she really was or had to become. She could be neither bad nor good with any reliability, because her parents were, or she felt they were, completely unpredictable and unreliable in their expressions of love or hatred, approval or disapproval. In retrospect, she concluded that they hated her, but at the time she said she was too baffled by them and too anxious to discover what she was expected to be to have been able to hate them, let alone love them. She now said that she was looking for comfort. She was looking for a line from me that would give her an indication of the path she was to follow. She found my non-directive attitude particularly hard to tolerate, since it seemed to her to be so clearly a repetition of her father's attitude. Ask no questions and you'll be told no lies. For a spell, she became subject to compulsive thinking, in which she was under a necessity to ask such questions as, "What is this for?" or "Why is this?" and to provide herself with the answers. She interpreted this to herself as her effort to get comfort from her own thoughts, since she could derive comfort from no one. She began to be intensely depressed and to make numerous complaints about her feelings, saying how childish they were. She spoke a great deal about how sorry she was for herself. Now, it seemed to me that she was not really sorry for her own true self. She sounded to me much more like a querulous mother complaining about a difficult child. Her mother, indeed, seemed to be coming out of her all the time, complaining about her childishness. Not only was this so as regards the complaints which she was making about herself, but in other respects as well. For instance, like her mother, she kept screaming at her husband and child. Like her mother, that is, like her notion of what her mother was. I never met her mother, and have no idea whether her fantasies of her mother bore any resemblance to her mother as a real person. But like her mother, she hated everyone, and like her mother, she was forever crying. In fact, life was a misery to her, by the fact that she could never be herself, but was always being her mother. She knew, however, that when she felt lonely, lost, frightened, and bewildered, she was more her true self. She knew also that she gave her complicity to becoming angry, hating, screaming, crying, or querulous, for if she worked herself up into being like that, i.e., being her mother, she did not feel frightened any more, at the expense, it was true, of being no longer herself. However, the backwash of this maneuver was that she was oppressed, when the storm has passed, by a sense of futility at not having been herself, and a hatred of the person she had been, her mother, and of herself for her self-duplicity. To some extent, this patient, once she had become aware of this false way of overcoming the anxiety she was exposed to when she was herself, had to decide whether avoiding experiencing such anxiety, by avoiding being herself, was a cure worse than her disease. The frustration she experienced with me, which called out intense hatred of me, was not fully to be explained by the frustration of libidinal or aggressive drives in the transference, but rather it was what one could term the existential frustration that arose out of the fact that I, by withholding from her the comfort she sought to derive from me, in that I did not tell her what she was to be, was imposing upon her the necessity to make her own decision about the person she was to become. Her feeling that she had been denied her birthright because her parents had not discharged their responsibility towards her by giving her a definition of herself that could act as her starting point in life, was intensified by my refusal to offer this comfort. But only by withholding it was it possible to provide a setting in which she could take this responsibility into herself. In this sense, therefore, the task in psychotherapy was to make, using Jaspers's expression, an appeal to the freedom of the patient. A good deal of the skill in psychotherapy lies in the ability to do this effectively.